This week, I welcome journalist and podcaster Josh Szeps.
Culture war issues that when you don't talk about them, whether that's vaccine side effects or concerns about pediatric transgender issues or the relationship between the races and whether or not countries like Australia and America are irredeemably white supremacist nations, whether pride makes sense, gay pride in the modern era, like all of those kinds of things that you find public broadcasters and the New York Times being too polite to talk about.
Right.
I think we need to do a better job of actually engaging with, because otherwise what happens is you get this large number of disaffected people who sort of smell a rat and think that the mainstream media is full of shit and go off and find other sources of information, some of which just start spiraling out of control into true weirdness.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you are welcome. You know the drill. Please subscribe, rate, comment, share, reach out, tell your friends, send smoke signals, whatever. We love your feedback and we want to hear from you. If you like our work and want to support us, the best way to do that is join Phetasy.com. You'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, outtakes, discounts on merch, and the ability to submit questions for some of our upcoming guests. Support your favorite scrappy little internet heroes at Phetasy.com. I'm with Josh Szeps, everybody. Welcome to Walk-Ins Welcome.
Look, it's so wonderful to be here. It's a great honor. I've just spent the past 45 minutes like an old man trying to set up my laptop to get the webcam working because, Bridget, all of my stuff is Apple stuff. And now I've got a work PC laptop that they've given me. And it prompted me that I needed to install
Chrome
updates. And then there was some background network updates or some bullshit like that. And so I click yes and just expecting it to restart. And 42 minutes later, it's still at 19%. So I had to run and steal someone else's laptop that I've never used and tether it to my phone's personal hotspot.
No.
I mean,
so
this is the Zoom world we live in, isn't it, folks?
But I mean, it is amazing that we can chat and you're in Australia.
Yeah. Yes. And I actually made it and my children didn't keep me. I have 5-year-old twins.
I know. I was going to ask you how the kids were.
Basically, I had to park them in front of there's like a new David Attenborough show with dinosaurs, and as long as I just keep them in front of that and distract them while I sneak out the back door, they won't realize that Daddy's gone for about 30 to 40 minutes.
Well, I really appreciate.
We'll just shove some food in their face.
Yeah, I mean the screen can help distract them as long as it's educational. I really appreciate your time and taking you away from your twins. How's it going raising the kids?
They're pretty good now. The first 3 years was a total shit show. I hated it. I would have been I would have handed those things back. They're little, I don't like babies, little wriggling lizard creatures. I like kids. I like children. And now they're getting to that stage where I'm like, okay, these are human beings who can actually talk to me about admittedly mundane bullshit, but at least they can still have a conversation of some kind. When they were 18 months old, it was just the pits. How old's your little one?
She just turned 9 months.
Okay, so you're just exiting the first phase of
first
hell.
Wave. Yeah,
for me.
Loved
and now it gets a little bit better.
I actually loved it so much more than I thought I would. I was never very into newborns or babies, but I am still breastfeeding. I actually didn't think I would like breastfeeding. I was shocked at how much I liked all of that. In fact, I'm like, I want another kid. Just because I'm already sad that we're moving out of the baby phase and into toddler, and she's definitely moving into toddler.
You just want another little lizard, to just be sucking on that teat.
Cute.
Just be dangling off your boob.
Yeah, they're
crazy about it.
The newborn bubble is really. I'm glad I listened to everybody who told me how magical it was and not to outsource. I live in Los Angeles where a lot of this stuff, it's pretty common. It's not with my pretty blue collar family and cousin. So I had never really heard of things like night nurses, and I knew everybody had nannies, but my family, my sisters in general and sister-in-law were like, don't outsource that night stuff, even though you're going to be exhausted and tired. It's such a precious bonding time with them, is like that 3 a.m. feeding, even though you're like, ugh.
Is that normal in LA? That you would? I think this is one of the benefits of living in essentially an apartheid state in the United States, where you have so many illegal immigrants that you can pay people a pittance. Is that why people can afford it? Because in Australia, where we don't have really illegal immigration because we don't have a big border, we're a poor country, and we basically just intercept any boats that come and then let them rot on desert islands that we send them to. You'd have to pay the night nanny, $35 or $45 an hour. So if you're spending thousands of dollars a week on that, that's not something that human beings do unless they're very wealthy.
Right. But I think I'm like the poorest one of all my friends. Even in
right. Okay.
Like I'm the poor friend. All of my friends are very
wealthy. Are the night nannies all like wealthy professional trained nurses, or are they Filipinos and Mexicans? Not that you can't be both, but
I would say they still get paid very well, because even finding a nanny, they basically will. I was asking around for help, and they said that they all get together and they kind of price set. Like all the nannies will.
Really, there's a cartel.
Yeah. Oh,
there's a cartel of Filipino night nannies. Running in the underbelly of Los Angeles.
Oh no, I wish that I would be way more interested in the real nannies of the Pacific Palisades, for instance, or Beverly Hills than I would in any of the women. Because when I worked in the Palisades at this restaurant, the nannies would come in and they'd sometimes be in there 3 times a day with the kids, like feeding these kids in this expensive kind of deli restaurant. And they would come in and they would all commiserate, and everybody that I worked for, the guys were like the true American dream. They started as dishwashers in a juice bar, saved their money, opened a juice bar, opened a restaurant. One was from Argentina, the other 2 were from Mexico. These guys, so everybody was Spanish speaking first. I was really the only like güera that worked there. And they would tell me what the nannies were saying. And I was like, holy shit, these women know everything. And they would all be exchanging information about all these like very famous and wealthy people.
Of course they do. Yeah.
But they were so corrupt too. So they would come in and they'd be like, we always hated it when the nannies came in, because they'd be like, here's money to get food for like little Ophelia or whatever, and go get her breakfast at the place and make sure you tip the waitress, and they would pocket our tip 90% of the time.
You're like, where's the class solidarity, bitch?
Nowhere.
We're supposed to be the working poor.
Nowhere.
How about a little bit off the top for me?
Yeah, no.
That's amazing. Yeah, I would have loved, in hindsight, I think I would have loved a night nanny, because I don't know how you're doing do you have help? How are you dealing with the exhaustion? I mean, the first like 8 months, and I'm married to a guy, so we didn't even have to breastfeed, but maybe that's even more annoying, because you have to then get up and like make milk in the microwave and shit instead of just latching the little lizard onto your tit. You have to go and do stuff. But that, for us, it was just a relentless fog of an endurance race that nobody wanted to be part of, not even the kids.
Oh yeah, no, I liked it, and I think I never needed that much sleep, so I do okay sleep deprived. I just was not one of those people that slept a lot before I had a kid. In the first couple months, I was sleeping on the couch, and we had the bassinet, and I basically was like, look, I've got to feed this baby anyway, so at least one of us needs to be functional, so my husband would be able to get some sleep so that he would make sure to like run the house. He took care of all the other stuff. So we kind of just divided up the labor, and I was also recovering from a C-section. So I didn't have much to do but lay around and just feed the baby. And so it was okay. It worked out. It just right now it's getting a little dodgy as she gets more mobile, and I have my cousin and producer on all of my stuff who she kind of now is like watching the baby when I have to do a podcast, for instance. Like it's just like a village.
Yeah, I remember that phase, but that's a great phase, like the 8 to 9 month phase, because they go from. But I do remember, like, I would leave them in the living room, and I'd go and do something in the kitchen, and I'd come back, and all of a sudden be like, "Where the fuck did they go? They're not supposed to be mobile. You just when they're 6 months old, you just plonk them down on the floor, and they're just they're good. They're good for the rest of the day. Just rolling around on their back,
kicking.
Now all of a sudden, once they're mobile, and then you wait over the next few months, all of a sudden, like. Where are the dummies, pacifiers, as you call them in the States, like that you need 7 million of them all over the house because all of a sudden they leave them all over the place and now they can move, now they can run, then they start, run like on all fours like a stupid little mammal, but nonetheless, they go fast.
I keep saying it's like, it's been like watching AI become sentient. Like that first year is so nuts. It's just wild watching I'm like, this thing could not do anything. 9 months ago, she was just a blob.
Well, wait until she can start asking you who you think would win between Wonder Woman and a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
I know.
Like then you're terrified. Like, how did that little lizard blob that I just spat out of my vagina turn into something that's now asking me complex questions?
Yeah.
How does that happen?
It's really it is quite a miracle, and just I love it. I really didn't think I would like it as much as I do. I honestly thought that it would like cramp my style because I was old. I'm old for having a baby. I mean, I guess not that old in West Los Angeles.
That's one thing I always say about you, Bridget. Like, do you know how old Bridget is? I mean, she is old. I'm talking old lady.
I feel like
old. I'm talking little old crotchety lady old.
I used to joke with my OB, like, I'm surprised you guys don't like pull the walker out for me when I get here. Are you okay?
That's
little
right.
geriatric,
Yeah.
But
the old hag's coming in.
He was telling me that even at my 43-year-old age, when he would look at some of his deliveries for that week, it would be like 47, 40. He's like, there was a day where 43 was his youngest. So I guess
people are waiting longer now. I snuck in about like 6 weeks before I turned 40.
Okay.
And I think that was right. I was like, I just got in there.
Yeah. Under
maybe
the wire.
About that. So now I can say I still had kids in my 30s.
Oh,
just because I squeezed out two.
I see.
Precisely the right moment. But yeah, no, I mean, it's also good to have lived a life, don't you think? I mean, I can't believe it when people get together and they marry their high school sweetheart and they start squirting out babies at the age of 19, and then you've got these 22-year-olds walking around dealing with all this stuff. It's kind of hard. It's hard being a parent to a little baby. Not for you maybe, but for a lot of people it is. And I don't know how I would have done it when I was in my early 20s. I didn't know shit.
Although I have a sister who started having kids very young and is basically the mirror opposite of my experience, and she and I talk about the pluses and minuses. For instance, one of the minuses is that the grandparents are much older. So her kids had the benefit of, and she lives in a small town near them. So they've had their grandparents in their life, literally their entire lives. And they're in their late teens and 20s. And she was saying, she feels like a grandma now because all of her siblings are having kids. And she's like, now I know what it feels like to be a grandparent. But she was saying the benefit of being young is that she's like, I would be the most neurotic parent if I had kids in my late 30s or 40s, as opposed to in her case, in her teens and in her early 20s, when she's like, I didn't know shit. She's like, I didn't know anything.
Interesting.
She was like, and you're just young. You don't have that. I see even my friends who had kids at like 29 recently, 30, and they seem a lot more. It was one of the reasons I didn't want to be an old mom, was I knew I'm kind of neurotic anyway, and I didn't want to be like, don't, be careful about which yogurt. I used to see these old moms in the store in LA, and they'd be like, which yogurt do you want? Just you could tell they were just freaking out about.
But that's not the trajectory of everyone's life. I think a lot of people, as they get older, they give fewer fucks. I definitely give fewer fucks. I would have worried a lot more when I was 20 or 22, precisely because I didn't know anything. I would have been like, oh my God, I have to look after these things. How do I do it? I don't know anything. I'm just a kid as well. There must be so much more that I need to know. Now that I'm in my 40s, I'm like, there's nothing left to know. I've checked it all out. Don't worry. Trust me. Everyone who thinks they know shit doesn't know shit anyway. And like, I'm much more cynical. I give zero fucks now. I'm like, the babies are going to look after themselves. They've been looking after themselves for millions of fucking years. They'll be fine. You know, there've been a lot worse parents than me. I wouldn't have had that perspective when I was 20.
There's that meme that goes around, which is actually quite classist, although it is kind of funny. And when I was getting very nervous approaching being a parent, and I think my cousin sent it to me, and it was like, whenever you're doubting your ability to parent, just go to a Walmart. It's classist. It's definitely,
so true.
But it's so also true.
Yeah.
Just
yeah.
That's
true. I mean, there are all kinds of.
There was a really funny one that someone put in my subscriber community, and it was like, whenever I questioned my ability to parent, and it was a little 6-year-old with like a cigar and a coal, you know, covered in coal.
Well, that's right. I mean, we used to send them down the bloody coal mines. You know, we used to get them to work. We used to get it. We used to beat them. Like, we used to beat them on the regular. Like, that was just a normal thing. And you still see that sometimes. I mean, maybe not at Walmart, but there are beaches that I can go to in Sydney where there will be, let's just say, certain demographics of
Bogans.
people. There'll be like, well, yeah, you might call them that. They'll be like, hey, come here. I'll smack up the side of their head. If you go near the water like that, I'll do it. And I'm like, I'm such a good parent. I'm amazing for just not doing anything. My complete lack of interest in my own children and lack of attention to their welfare is so far superior to either the violently overbearing parents who I see or the violently overcaring parents who I see, like what you're talking about at the supermarket, trying to decide between 16 different types of yogurt as if the child actually gives a shit or it makes any difference whatsoever. What I'm saying, Bridget, is I'm the perfect Goldilocks parent, right in the middle. Not too strict.
Not too violent.
Not too neither too violent nor too absent, shall we say.
So when you're jokingly talking about how you've kind of been talked to a lot of the people that you thought knew things and realized they didn't know anything, how did you get into, you know, doing your podcast, which is talking to a lot of people who I would say I think know things?
Yeah, I like talking to people who know things. I'm interested in things. I mean, no, I only tend to talk to people who know something about something that I find interesting. I don't have on people who I think are just full of hot gas. I mean, I always wanted to have a radio show or a TV show where I got to talk to interesting people. I grew up idolizing Jon Stewart and Dave Letterman, and I just thought, well, that would be a cool thing to do. And so when I could, I moved to New York, and because I started out doing like satirical comedy sketches on Australian radio, and I'm kind of good at doing impersonations. So I would be like the kind of sidekick on a big radio show here, where I would write comedy sketches and pretend to be like the Prime Minister or some celebrity or something.
Did you go to uni? Did you go to uni?
Uni, great Australianism, Bridget.
Thank you.
Yeah, I give you one point towards your Australian citizenship.
I'm so bad at accents.
You'll need 100 million points.
I'm so bad at accents. They're funny. Like I'm so bad at them. They actually become comical.
Give me your best Australian. Go on.
I can't right now because I need to really try and let go of my self-consciousness. I don't even know. I feel like I end up sounding more like a Kiwi. Did. Yeah, the Kiwis sound like did. We got burgled when I was in Saint-Tropez, and I'll never forget, like, the daughter being like, Did, somebody stole my Rolex.
Did.
Somebody stole my Rolex.
He's a robber in here. Yeah, Kiwis are. My mum's a Kiwi, so I was just over there visiting some family, and the basic difference is that they say words instead of saying fish, they'll say fish. Instead of saying Sydney, they'll say Sydney. So that's the tell. That's the tell for a Kiwi. Is that vowel? Fish, Sydney.
So sorry to interrupt with my bad accent. Did you go to uni?
That's all right. So I did go to uni. Yeah, I did I did journalism and media studies. I went to college. I dated Brad in college. We used to go down and do some lacrosse. That's my interpretation of.
I know, it's so funny. I remember
in the United States.
I was teaching the child how to say water. I've just been saying words to her, as you do, and I was thinking of my Kiwi ex-boyfriend making fun of the way that we say water. He's like, it's not water. It's water. Because we were in London. And he's like, it's water. Yeah, it's water. And so when I was teaching her how to say water, I was like teaching her how to say water. And my husband's like, why are you teaching her how to say this one word? Like in a different accent.
Like, you gotta say it like me. Water.
You gotta say it like me.
Say some
water.
That's right, water. Yeah, tea and scones. Well, I'm married to an American, so our kids have this weird thing where, like, my daughter will say, like, stuff like, I can do it. And then I'll say, and then she'll say, I can't. And I'll be like, that's not how you say can't. She can't. I can't get the water. I mean, I can't get the water, young lady. Speak like a proper Aussie.
Speak like a member of the colony.
That's right, exactly. Salute the king. We've got a king now. Isn't that cool? We've got a king for the first time in anyone's memory. Used to only have a queen.
So crazy.
Anyway, so yeah, I did communications and journalism and media production and like film, television, radio studies at the University of Technology, Sydney, and did like philosophy and like a whole bunch of political and social theory subjects at Sydney University. And I mean, I could have gone into comedy. I sort of dabbled into, I was in an improv troupe and I did a show at the Melbourne Comedy Festival when I was at university. And then I was like, I don't really want to go on the road and be like staying in dingy motels and trying to, you know, do shows in front of a few drunk people at a club here or there. I was like, just go into journalism and then find my way across to being a joker and a jester on radio or TV somehow. And it turned out that was, I think, the right move. Like, I became a radio producer of talk radio in Sydney, then got on the air by doing like some funny kind of pranks and things. I remember the first time I was on the air, I was like rappelling down the side of a skyscraper for charity. And like, it was one of those things where like the host of the radio show couldn't do it. So they were like, send Monkey Boy, send the teenage, producer in. And I was like, broadcasting live from the 117th floor of some skyscraper, and then found my way into doing like satirical comedy, and then decided to move to New York just because I really thought there would be I would get so much more experience there than I could in a market the size of Australia's, and spent the first 12 years of my professional life in New York City, and I've spent more of my adult life there than I have in Australia. And I had a show on Discovery Science Channel initially, which was like a smart-assy look at, it was kind of like The Soup. Do you remember John?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. That was a great show.
Yeah, it was like that, but for science and tech news, like smart-assy take on shit that's going on in science and tech. And that ran for 3 seasons. And then I moved to LA for a year and sort of sniffed around and to see if I wanted to live there. And I was like, no, I want to go back to New York. And went back to New York. And that was when HuffPost was like the most read online only news site in the world.
People forget
at the time. This is, I guess, 10 years ago. Yeah. People forget or maybe weren't alive in 2012. But it was billions of views a day. And
was that when
they wanted
Breitbart
to launch
was
television.
There? Wasn't he helping Ariana?
think that would predated that. I think before Ariana
Pivoted.
set up HuffPost, I think they might have had some kind of thing. Yeah, pivoted.
Yeah.
Because she was a conservative.
Right.
She was a conservative when conservatives were sane.
Right. And then I feel like
she was like on Bill Maher's show as a conservative in the like 90s and stuff. And then, but by 2012, no, Breitbart wasn't anywhere to be seen. Breitbart was off doing, crazy right-wing Breitbart stuff, and HuffPost was doing crazy left-wing HuffPost stuff. But HuffPost was eating everyone's lunch. And they wanted to figure out a way of like revolutionizing television conversations, basically conversations about the news. And so they wanted to launch HuffPost Live, which would be 12 hours a day of streaming studio-based conversations with viewers able to join in via webcam and comment in a comment thread and like fully interactive. It was like if an alien was going to come down to Earth and just start having conversations via a broadcast medium about stuff that's going on in the world, what would it look like? And it obviously wouldn't look like an old white man talking at you for half an hour every evening on the news and then saying, that's the way it is, and then now you can turn off your TV. It would be interactive and participatory and organic, and it would involve the viewer, and it would be like fast. And so they brought me on as one of 6 hosts in
a young
New
white
York.
Man.
I was I think the token, but I was just weird enough. That was the good thing about being Australian in the American media landscape. They're like, he's kind of like oozing white privilege, but he's Australian, so he's got something different going on about him. And so we all brainstormed about what this thing would be, and then it launched in 2012. And for a while, it was like the hot place to be. We had great bookers. We had all the biggest stars coming through. It was fantastic. It was amazing, just interviewing all of my heroes, Dick Cavett and Michael Moore, and just a lot of Susan Sarandon and Russell Brand and all these people who I'd looked up to. So that was a great thing to be doing in my 20s and in New York City, and I was living the life. And then the wheels gradually fell off that thing over the course of. No, not all of those people. It was 10 years ago. I was a kid, Bridget.
Yeah, like I'm curious. Do you still look up to like Russell Brand 10 years later? I wonder.
It's very odd, isn't it? This is the subject of several of my conversations on Uncomfortable Conversations now. And I just had a chat with Sam Harris, who is an old friend of mine, about this phenomenon of all these people who we used to knock around with. Like, so I had Sam on HuffPost Live, and we got to know each other a bit. And then he came on my earlier podcast. And
oh, wow. You've known Sam for a while.
Joe Rogan's show for a while, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Since the End of Faith, Letter to a Christian Nation.
Yeah, I read that book when it came out.
Harris,
he seemed very comfortable with you, but now that makes sense that he is,
yes.
That you guys have known each other long enough, you have that kind of rapport.
Yeah, that's right. So when I was in New York, the Richard Dawkins Foundation, which has an American offshoot called the Center for Inquiry, which is like a nonprofit that fosters secularism and science and reason and rationality. They had a podcast that I did for them called Point of Inquiry. And so I got involved with Richard Dawkins, with his foundation. I moderated some of his events in the States. In fact, 2 days after Donald Trump was elected, he and I were scheduled to take the stage in Philadelphia, and that was a wild conversation because we were both just shell-shocked. I was like, well, my first question was, what the hell just happened? And like the whole audience burst out laughing, and Dawkins was like, I don't know. It's just so depressing. I'm actually doing an event in Australia this month with Richard Dawkins. He's coming out on a tour. So if anyone's watching this in Brisbane, you can get tickets to our event with Richard Dawkins. But anyway, so yes, I was involved. I was like in that whole scene, as Sam Harris was one of the. There was Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and a couple of other people who were like the new atheists, Christopher Hitchens, who were taking a full frontal assault on religion after 9/11, just saying like, we can't have these prehistoric beliefs guiding billions of people anymore. This is becoming a liability for civilization. So I guess I got to know Sam a little bit then. And then Joe Rogan watched some stuff that I was doing on HuffPost in like 2014 and became a mini fan of mine and invited me on his show. And I've done Joe's show 7 times. And that also is in the vague Sam Harris, I guess, universe of like alternative media and stuff. And then in 2017 or 2018, Sam and like Majid Nawaz and Douglas Murray and Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein all came out to Australia for an event, for a multi-day event. And I was the moderator of that. And that then became, I suppose, the intellectual dark web, so to speak. Like Eric coined that term. Barry Weiss wrote a New York Times article about it. And I was sort of located in relation to that group of people in a similar way to, I suppose, the way Barry Weiss it was and is, which is like at a journalistic distance to the intellectual dark web, but curious about what this phenomenon is and trying to understand how we should think about, I guess, the flaws of the mainstream media, the blind spots of the mainstream media, the groupthink of the mainstream media. And I now have a daily talk radio show on the big national public broadcaster in Australia, in its biggest market in Sydney. And so I'm very much now implicit and complicit in the mainstream media, right, the public broadcaster here. And I'm one of the people in the mainstream who understands the flaws of the system and of my colleagues and wants us to be talking in a more bullshit-free way about some of the touchier, tripwire culture war issues that when you don't talk about them, whether that's vaccine side effects or concerns about pediatric transgender issues or whatever it might be, or, you know, Black Lives, the relationship between the races and whether or not countries like Australia and America are irredeemably white supremacist nations, or whether we should all be striving to get along rather than differentiate each other, or whether it's, you know, whether pride makes sense, gay pride in the modern era, like all of those kinds of things that you find public broadcasters and the New York Times being too polite to talk about.
Right.
I think we need to do a better job of actually engaging with, because otherwise what happens is you get this large number of disaffected people who sort of smell a rat and think that the mainstream media is full of shit and go off and find other sources of information, some of which just start spiraling out of control into true weirdness. And that's what's happened here with, like you mentioned, this is all a long way of answering your question about Russell Brand. Russell is one of the like sharpest, quickest, you know, smoothest, savviest, and funniest people in the world. And he, like so many of those other people who I just name-checked who came to Australia, Majid, Brett, has like gone off down this rabbit hole of conspiratorial hyperbole and suspicion, and I don't quite know how to explain it. So Sam Harris, if I'm new to you and you haven't heard my interview with Sam Harris recently, then go back to Uncomfortable Conversations and listen to it, because I sort of invite Sam to like really dig deep about what is it about this group of people that makes them so susceptible to conspiratorial thinking. And he sort of takes the bait in an open way about, like, you know, is he like a bad judge of character for having associated with all of these people? What was it with that group of people?
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a bad judge of character, because that comes across to me as being, this is something I've had a hard time balancing and navigating somewhat, but I think my internal factory setting as being a comedian helps me, because I feel like everyone is up for mockery. The interesting part of your conversation that you had, where you were talking about, can you take friends, you know, like when all this stuff was going around about Joe and people were reaching out to me when his, like, you know, they dropped the like N-word mixtape on him and they were trying to cancel him or whatever. And people were reaching out to me, and I was like, I'm Joe's friend. I'm not going to do a podcast about this. I'm not going to write some piece to like boost my Substack about this. I am his friend, and I'll be supportive of him. That's it. I just like,
I went out
okay
and defended him. I mean,
I'm okay with being like, I'm biased in this. Like, he's my buddy, and that comes before any of this.
But I don't believe it, Bridget. I don't believe it's just because he was your friend. I think also you just thought that you could sense that was a bullshit takedown. That was my sense. My sense was, even if I wasn't a friend of his, I would still be defending him against this, because there's obviously an orchestrated campaign to bring him down.
Of course.
For bullshit reasons.
Right. But I still believe in friendship. And that's the weird thing about, I'm not sure you can really have friends in media. I've had to kind of learn the hard way that I think Joe is rare. I think he's a person that elevates people. He's willing to check himself. He's open to being checked. I think that was when I became aware of you, is when you got into it, and then everyone was like, oh, here's this libtard on Joe's podcast or whatever. But Joe was kind of like, hey,
that's on my business card. It just says libtard, previously on Joe Rogan's show. Yeah, if people don't know what you're talking about, just before he had the whole cancel thing in January of 2022, and before Spotify, like just at the moment that the whole Spotify shit was going down about, Neil Young pulling his songs and stuff, I think I was the guest immediately before that. And Joe and I had an exchange about myocarditis and heart inflammation caused by mRNA vaccines. And it was the case then, and it remains the case, that COVID causes inflammation all over your body in ways that are worse than mRNA vaccines. But there is, of course, a huge mythology around heart side effects, especially among young males, which is a real thing. We know that that's a side effect from the mRNA vaccines. And so if you're a young male, then get AstraZeneca or Novavax. Don't get, but you should still get vaccinated.
But can they get that in the United? Can they get that in the United States? I don't know if they can.
I don't know.
That's like one area where I think, because I've seen a lot of my friends who have kids who are in college, and they keep making them get these boosters, and I'm like, stop making these kids get these boosters. They don't fucking need them.
Well, who's making them?
The schools.
That's what I don't understand. Like,
the schools are making it as part of the ability for them to go to college. I mean, this like red pilled so many 22-year-old guys that I know, because they were like huge liberals, and then they're reaching out to me and they're like, I've been red pilled by this mandatory vaccine for me to go to college. And I'm like, they all had it like multiple times. It's just
and my doctor doesn't even, it's much more laid back, I gotta say here. It's so funny because like there was so much hysteria about Australia having fallen and become a dictatorship and everything in 2021. And what had basically happened was that we had closed the borders in March of 2020, had launched a massive contact tracing operation to track down everybody who had met everybody who had the disease, had implemented mandatory quarantine for returning Australians, but have basically permitted anyone who wasn't an Australian from coming in. And all of the states kind of blocked themselves off from each other and successfully eradicated the virus completely. So in states like Western Australia and Tasmania and Queensland, people were just going about their lives for 2 years. There was no masks, there was no school closures, there was no nothing. People were going to the theatre, people were going to pubs, people were going out and eating at restaurants. There was no pandemic. And then what happened was, when Delta emerged, all of those epidemiological assumptions that had enabled us to successfully contact trace the occasional outbreaks that would happen from quarantine hotels. And these were, by the way, quarantine was mostly in 4-star hotels in Sydney and Melbourne. And you'd spend 2 weeks in a hotel, and the government would pay for 3 meals a day from nearby restaurants, and they'd put you up. Not great, but you don't have to come back to the country either if you don't want to be, quarantined. And that was what enabled millions and millions and millions of people to live as if there was no pandemic, essentially. And then Delta was so infectious that once it escaped, then it was out of the bag. And this was just at the point where we were getting vaccinated. So you had like this window of time in which it was like, well, okay, we can either just let it rip and risk the possibility of essentially time shifting our epidemic back to March of 2020 and enduring what New York and Northern Italy and London went through in March of 2020, where we essentially in 2021 in Australia had a large population of people who had already been culled in the United States and the UK and Europe. We had a lot of old people and immune suppressed people who had died. And our COVID death rate ended up being 90% less per capita than the United States. So we had to go, are we just going to sacrifice all those people, or are we going to try to have a lockdown until we're all vaccinated? And there was this window of about, I think it was 10 weeks, where Americans were like, what the fuck is going on in Australia? Because like the pandemic's basically over here. Like it's ripped through. The people who needed to die have died. And now we're all kind of sort of getting on with our lives. And yet Australians are locked inside, like quivering with fear. We thought Aussies were supposed to be tough. Like
I was definitely police, like, saying that on Dumpster
telling
Fire.
They can't go to the beach.
Yeah.
Like,
I was like, what is going on?
What was actually happening was, we weren't afraid, cowering inside. We were trying to protect the people who we knew would die if we let it rip. And we successfully got to 80% vaccination, and then opened up, and then opened the borders, and then opened everything. And so that's just the explanation. That you don't have to think that is justified. You might say there's never any reason for the police to have the authority to require people to essentially inhibit their freedoms that much as in a lockdown. But what that does mean, and this is a long way of getting back to your point about college students and being forced to take vaccines and stuff, what it does mean is that a lot of the frustrations that Americans have with the left's hysterical overreaction to COVID are not things that we actually ever experienced here, like school closures.
Right.
Like intense, vaccine mandates on young people.
Small businesses. I haven't had my small businesses got
exactly.
crushed.
I mean, we had a lot of government support. It was done in a very systematic way. Most people made money out of the pandemic because there was so much stimulus. It wasn't as haphazard as it was conducted in the States, where you had people who were in the know able to get PPP loans from banks if they had a relationship with their banker, but regular people were fucked, and small businesses who didn't have connections were fucked. It was just a much more even-keeled thing here. So sometimes I think when I'm in conversations with Americans and they're like, "Oh, Australia went crazy," they assume that our schools were closed and our children were masked. My kids were never masked. There were very, very brief periods where they didn't go to daycare. They kept going to preschool and daycare. The priority was keep schools open, keep life functioning as much as possible, unless you need to lock down. But even during lockdown, there was still, exemptions and exceptions made to the greatest extent possible to permit education. I think what happened in the States with the interminable closure of schools and the masking of little kids, long after we knew that transmission, was low amongst kids and that they were not affected by this disease, was just shameful and irrational and unscientific. So I think you can have both positions. I mean, I think I have a rational, defensible position on this stuff.
Yeah, I still, and we're still having this conversation about like the mandatory vaccines for these 20-year-olds, where we know that, I feel like we know so much more than we did. And my big hesitation, I guess, and where I think perhaps I understand when you ask the question, where is the conspiracy? How are people getting into this conspiracy? I am not comfortable. I'm in the same way that I'm not comfortable going down a 100% conspiracy theory rabbit hole. I'm not comfortable with saying, no, there are no side effects at all. And we know this because we've had these vaccines for 2 years.
I mean, who is saying that at this point? But
I
who's saying
but
that
I
at
think a
this
lot
point?
of people in this discussion come across as quite smug and quite certain that these vaccines are just, there's the side effects are not a big deal, even if they might be a big deal. These things that I don't know that they should be minimized, like for instance, I will always go back to the fact that when I said the vaccine messed with my period, everyone told me I was a conspiracy theorist. I'm like, what happened to lived experience, yo? I'm just talking about what happened to me.
Yeah.
And you're telling me I'm a conspiracy theorist. Then I went to my OBGYN, and the nurse practitioner who is like doing all my pre-doctor stuff, I'm very technical. She was like, oh, everyone's periods are messed up from the vaccine. Just, said that happened.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, everyone, don't you think like this was after the first round of vaccines. I'm like, don't you think this should be something we're having a conversation? Then all these women, there's this one like very creepy kind of MSNBC segment where a woman came on and was like, this is hysteria. There isn't any evidence. And every comment on the YouTube video was a woman telling her story of how her period was messed up from the vaccine. Now, I'm not saying it caused infertility because I got pregnant after maybe it kept that one egg around so that I could get that menopause baby.
Maybe it made you more fertile, baby. We don't know.
I'm not saying that it makes, I'm not down that rabbit hole. But this is where this lack of faith in institutions is, and people even I at that point was like, well, fuck all of you, because this absolutely happened to me. And then it comes out and they trot it out and they're like, actually, it does affect your menstrual cycle. And we decided to study. This is another thing being a woman where they're like, oh, they don't study women the way that they study things for men. They didn't even consider, the reason they didn't consider how the vaccine might affect your menstrual cycle is because they didn't even look at how COVID affected your menstrual cycle. So they weren't even like.
No, that's right. But I mean, that is a good point in the sense that like we do have a bias towards noticing the problems with the vaccines because we have a bias towards fearing acts of commission rather than acts of omission. In other words, it scares us more to do something that could cause harm than to not do something that causes harm, right? So like getting injected and then having a side effect is scarier than not doing something. But the reality is if you give 1 billion people any medication, then you're going to get side effects. If you give I think Sam Harris has made the point that if the cure for Ebola was peanut butter, then, peanut butter is dangerous to some people. And if you give it to 1 billion people, then some people are going to die from peanut butter. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't be worth inoculating 1 billion people against Ebola if there's an Ebola outbreak using peanut butter. Now, there are side effects to the vaccines. It's hard for people to remember what it was like in the early days of the pandemic because when most people get COVID, it's not a big deal. Well, guess what? When most people get a vaccine, it's also not a big deal. But when you're talking about billions of people, then you give billions of people COVID unvaccinated, it's a big fucking deal. Like lots and lots and lots of those people will die and lots of those people will have long COVID and lots of those people will have inflammation that inflames their heart and all the rest of their body. And their heart is just one organ that gets fucked up by COVID.
Yeah.
So my point was always just, yes, let's be much more open and honest about the side effects of the vaccines. I've done a whole segment on my radio show. I'm probably the only person, I think, on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation who's done a full segment about vaccine side effects because the head of the Australian Medical Association, the former head, she had a vaccine side effect. Her wife had a vaccine side effect. I had a cardiologist on who is talking about how he's seeing a big uptick in pericarditis or myocarditis, I can't remember which, in young males, heart inflammation in young males. His point is still that it's much less than if everybody was unvaccinated and was just getting COVID because, not all the time, but in enough cases, COVID causes inflammation throughout the body that also impacts your heart in worse ways and in more severe ways and in longer lasting ways than the vaccines do. But none of that is to say that we shouldn't be worried about, minimizing the side effects of vaccines. So anyway, I had this run-in with Joe Rogan, which I think is how we got onto this subject in the first place. at just the moment where everybody in the culture was starting to wring their hands about, well, not everybody, a certain cohort of, let's just say very mainstream thinking people about COVID got very worried about misinformation on Joe's show because of some questionable people who he'd interviewed about COVID, like Robert McCullough. And so then Neil Young was going to pull his music from Spotify.
I think he did pull it.
There was a huge pile on about Joe. He did, right? Yeah.
Which is just hilarious to me because the guy is worth like hundreds of millions of dollars and acting like he's some freaking revolutionary. I'm like, you sold your entire body of work to like a freaking hedge fund. Like, you are not the revolutionary dude in the 60s. Yeah. Like, you're just a rich old 100-millionaire who's like, I'm taking a stand. Like, no, you're not. No, you're not.
Exactly. Give me your money. And
no one even knows who you are, Neil Young, who wasn't born before the 70s.
True. I was not actually familiar with this gentleman's
or after the 70s.
Before, yeah, exactly. And then that video about the N-word came out, and I was like, "Oh, I see. It's a pile-on where they're just trying to get Joe." And so I was interviewed. I had invitations to come on Australian TV shows and talk about, Joe Rogan and misinformation and everything. And I did so just so that I could slap them down and be like, listen, the stuff that he was talking about 2 years ago is now, well understood science. Some of it. We don't know. You never know at any point in time what's going to end up being true. So Joe wants to throw a lot of ideas at the wall and see what sticks. And that's legitimate for what his show is. Would I do it on the national public broadcaster? No, because I would need more evidence before I started spitballing about these things. But it doesn't mean that there's no place in a free society for somebody who spitballs about such things. So,
and a lot of the things that people were saying were conspiracies ended up being, or accused people of being conspiracy theorists for suggesting or talking about ended up being true. And it's funny, I just had Michael Shermer on and we had a long conversation about this because his whole new book is, it actually drops tomorrow. His whole book is about conspiracy, and he was trying to, I think he's viewed what's gone on in very much a similar way where you're like, all right, that person made some sense back when they were kind of criticizing some of the extremes on the left, and that person made some sense perhaps when they were criticizing some of the stuff that they're seeing on the right, but then just spun off into I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have because and this is what I was asking Michael Shermer, like, how do you guard yourself against it? I think conspiracy theories are funny. So I like to entertain. I think Joe and I are similar in this respect, in that like they're fun. I find them amusing. Although, like I said, I'm not so certain of myself that I could be just out there saying, we know this is, like I can't predict that in 5 years there won't be some massive lawsuit because these vaccines have side effects that we knew nothing about. And we've seen this before with pharmaceutical companies. So I'm just not that confident in pharmaceutical companies being honest and my own certainty on things to be like, just take, like, I feel like people should kind of be able to make their own decision on this. I
don't think you need to, but let me put your mind at ease. You don't need to rely on the trustworthiness of pharmaceutical companies. I don't think anybody was doing that. There was, the testing was independent, and then once after like 1 billion people had been jabbed and there was no uptick in mortality, then I think that's the point at which you go, okay, well, the real world experiment has been run, and no number of online mashups of footballers falling over because they were smashed in the heart and then had cardiac arrest is going to change the fact that we've given more than 4 billion people this thing and we haven't seen widespread fatalities from it. So so data data doesn't lie, but anecdotes do and can. So for me, it was not about like, oh, I think Pfizer is really trustworthy. It was just like, what's the balance of probabilities here?
I got the Johnson & Johnson, and I got it the day before they pulled it off the market for a week here. So I got it.
Wow.
Woke up and was dying because I got pretty sick from it. And like woke up to the text from my friends. It's like, did you see this? And I was like, great, I'm going to die.
Like, oh, great. Thanks a lot. I mean, I think it all depends on your situation as well, right? I mean, if you're a 20-year-old male and you've already had COVID and you're already boosted, I mean,
they don't have a choice if they're going to college.
But what? But why? We already know that it doesn't have a major impact on transmission. So
I don't know.
Who gives a shit?
They literally can't go to college without proof that they got vaccinated. It's still mandatory for healthcare workers in California. Like you still, my husband's in the healthcare industry and just got a notice that he needs to like get his booster. And I don't know. It just seems like,
I kind of understand with healthcare workers.
I get it with healthcare. I get it.
Because you're interacting with, with people who are very old or sick.
Well, no, he's in therapy. He's in recovery. So he's considered a healthcare worker, but it's because he's in like the therapists are considered in healthcare. Like they're so because he works with
that seems silly.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like an opportunity to maybe carve out which healthcare workers are actually, forward-facing, with people who are about to die.
I think America's just so big, too. Yeah, it was
I always hate that argument, though. It's like it's such a cop out to say it's big.
It is not a cop out. First of all, it's federalism. So you had states that were doing one thing and states that were doing another thing, and people would be like, I know, but you don't have 330 million people. I know,
but you don't have to coordinate 330 million people all at once. Like
we definitely aren't an island that can shut down our borders. Like
that's true.
People would compare us to New Zealand, and I'm like, okay, so then you have to figure out how to shut our borders. First of all, good luck with that. In case you pay any attention to the news, maybe not the news you watch, but some other of the news you don't watch. And also, people got mad at Trump when he wanted to do that. When he was like, we're shutting our borders to China.
Oh, I know.
And people were like, you're racist.
I never understood the argument. I never understood the argument of like, oh, closing your borders doesn't do anything and lockdowns don't do anything.
Totally does.
Like, if a virus is transmitted by one person breathing on another person and that person can't come and breathe on me, it's going to make a difference, surely, isn't it? Like, or if I'm staying in my house, isn't that going to make a difference if I go outside?
But yeah,
I'm just to put a button in the America being so big thing. This is what would always like Americans will say America's too big to deal with X when they're fucked up at dealing with X, and then when there's something they do really well, like say the military, nobody says, oh. If America spent 90% less on its military, and someone said, you know what, America could have like the biggest military, and look at Switzerland. America could have the Swiss military. Then Americans could say we couldn't possibly have a military that is as comparatively large as the Swiss military is to Switzerland. We're way too big. I mean, how big would that be? It'd be like hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Like, we're too big to do that. But when you think about it and you put your mind to it, then you actually do it. Everything's scalable. Like Australia is as much larger than New Zealand as the United States is to Australia. Like everything, you have more people, but then you also have more taxpayers and more people who are available to be the organizers within the systems that you're organizing. It's true that if you were talking about having an emperor who has to rule over 330 million people, then that might be unmanageable. But in a federation, as you say, when you've got states and you've got counties, if you devolve power and you organize things at a local level rather than all coming from Washington, D.C., then everything's scalable. Germany Germany is massively bigger than New Zealand is. Germany has like 80 million people and New Zealand has like 4. There are all kinds of things that Germans could say, we can't possibly do healthcare, universal healthcare, the way the Kiwis do. We have 80 million people. They have 4. Of course they can do it. But it's not true. You have more taxpayers as well. You have more ingenuity as well. You have more innovation as well. You have more resources as well. You can scale up. America scales up when it cares about scaling up. America scales up in tech. Scales up, well, tech and the military, I would say, are good examples of that. But yeah,
we definitely haven't figured out the healthcare. But it still made, I mean, it was wild because I would go on road trips with my husband during COVID, and it is like different countries. Like we would drive from California to Arizona, and people were just out with their families passing around beanbags, playing the cornhole game. And we were just like coming from LA, which is probably the most stringent lockdown state of all of them. We might still be in lockdown. I don't know. They still threatened to go into lockdown. Like, I think 2 weeks ago they were threatening because the woman who looks like she is a keeper of the crypt, not an elected official in Los Angeles, Barbara Ferrer, is an insane person. And she always is like, we're locking down. She'll threaten it constantly. It's bananas. And we can't get rid of her.
Wild.
Yeah.
That is wild. No, I mean, in November, December of 2021, the New South Wales Premier, who's like the governor of the most populous state, was like, that's it. Like, we are never locking down again from COVID. No matter what happens, basically, it's never happening again. Like, we're done. Like, if you loved the lockdowns, get over it, because now we're just letting it rip. We're all like, because the point is, what's the lockdown achieve? You're all vaccinated at that point, and there's no better time to allow a pathogen to sweep through a population than just after they've all been double vaxxed at that point.
Was it mandatory to be a citizen? Would you have been like booted out of Australia?
No, but they made it tough in terms of like, you couldn't. I mean, you wouldn't at that time when they were really sprinting fast to end the lockdown and get everyone vaccinated. If you weren't vaccinated, then you weren't allowed to do a whole bunch of things. Like, it was pretty strict. It was like, because you would still have to, you would still like check a QR code to check in to like get into a gym, for example, and you wouldn't be able to if you weren't vaccinated. So it was like, there was definitely a 2-tier system during that sprint towards the finish line. No. Then
in light of the fact that like it doesn't prevent transmission, doesn't that seem unfair?
That is the actual scandal, Bridget. I mean, that's the thing that I think we're missing a lot. And I did a recent podcast episode on Uncomfortable Conversations where I was doing like a mea culpa about what I got wrong about COVID. And that's the main thing, that I should have been more skeptical about claims about the impact on transmission, and I wasn't. There was good reason to assume that vaccines would be as effective on transmission as they were on like your health,
like polio.
So they basically no. What I mean is, if in the past when we've had vaccines, if they were highly, highly effective at reducing the chance of serious illness and death, then they also were effective at reducing transmission. It's reasonably rare to have a vaccine that's fantastically effective at protecting you against serious illness and death. Yeah, but quite lousy at transmission. Mm-hmm. Because as I understand it, like the whole point of the transmission is that you're most infectious normally when you're most symptomatic, right? Because you're coughing all over everybody and you're spluttering and sneezing. Now that's also the point at which you are most aware that you're sick, so you're able to quarantine yourself. But if you just didn't give a shit about anybody, then you would be most infectious when you're coughing. So normally, if it's effective at stopping you from coughing.
Right, but I think that it was more, the reason I had such an issue with it as well is that it gave people this false sense that because they were vaccinated, they were not transmitting the disease if they were sick. So even if they were,
that was the mistake. That was the mistake, and that was a big problem, and that is why I don't understand why there would still be universities in the States where young people have to get vaccinated. Because, as I understand it, I think you roughly halve your rate of transmission if you're vaccinated. So it does have some effect, but it's not like the 99% reduction in your risk of death and hospitalization, which the vaccines provide. So I do wish, yes, in hindsight, you're right. The Australian policy of like, let's get everybody vaccinated and punish people who aren't by sort of excluding them from public spaces like gymnasiums or fitness centers or whatever it was, or schools and hospitals.
Or Djokovic.
That in hindsight was probably overreach. Yeah, Djokovic at the time,
you motherfuckers.
when the Australian Open was on in 2021.
We still won't let him in. We still won't let him into America.
What?
Yes.
Are you serious?
No.
He just won the Australian Open.
I know.
I
love him.
Yeah.
It burned through our freaking whole population. We still won't let Djokovic in. They're literally suing. In New York, there's like a lawsuit, and they're giving them back all the state workers who refused to get the vaccine, or the city workers, and they got laid off. They've sued the state. They won, and now they're getting back pay for being laid off. Because you can't, and they still won't let Djokovic. I'm like, this feels personal at this point.
That is ridiculous. I mean, yeah, exactly. They just don't like the guy, frankly. No, but I mean, I had the same experience where after the borders opened in Australia, and because one side effect of the border closures, which was absolutely insane, was that you weren't allowed to leave the country either. That was the most insulting and dictatorial piece of like authoritarianism in the whole suite of Australian
prisoners
eras.
Again.
You were a prisoner.
Again.
Now, to be fair, it's a pretty nice It's a pretty nice country to be imprisoned in. Like,
no,
it's
totally.
The most sparsely populated, rich country, and there are nice beaches. So
I have
there
a
are worse
whole
places,
stand-up routine.
I was fucking outraged. Yeah.
I have a whole stand-up routine about how back when it was a prison colony, because when I went to Australia, I was like, so just beautiful. I'm like, can you imagine leaving that shit ass London and that industrial, like the worst time to be in London? It must have just been disgusting. And then you're a prisoner and you get sent on this like 6-month journey, and you end up in Australia, and you're like, hey mate, go rob a bank. Like, get your ass down here. It's amazing. And then they have no infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so they have to like basically free the prisoners and put them to work building. And you hear these stories down there, but it's like, oh, this guy came because he like murdered someone in a bar fight, and then he ended up becoming an engineer and building.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he built the Sydney Harbour Bridge and spent the rest of his days on Bondi Beach getting the suntan. Yeah. Absolutely. So we couldn't leave the country. We weren't allowed to leave the country. Absolute insanity. That was ostensibly because they wanted to, manage the hotel quarantine, and they didn't want people frivolously going overseas. So you could apply to leave the country if you had, a family member was dying abroad, or if you got a funeral or a wedding or something. But huge pain in the ass. You couldn't just go on a holiday because they didn't want to increase the burden on. You could go if you signed a thing saying, I'm not going to come back within 90 days.
Yeah, my friend is dating an Aussie actor, and his mom has cancer, and like he had to film a show, but then getting back into the country, couldn't see her. It was like, I'm like, what is going on? How can you not leave your country?
That was the most awful bit. So anyway, my point was with Djokovic and not. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, this is why people go down these rabbit holes. Like, as we have this conversation and you're saying, how do people end up? Like, those are pretty serious things. You can't leave the country and come back and see your mom was dying of cancer. People couldn't see their loved ones, dying. Granted, that was pretty early, but these are things that I think traumatize people in a way that allows them to believe something nefarious must be at play. But go on, what you're saying about my favorite.
I mean... Just on that point of like believing that something nefarious is at play, I've always believed the adage that if you have to choose between an explanation that is conspiracy or incompetence, then with people you can usually bet on incompetence. Like, yeah, maybe there was a huge conspiracy to butter up. This is the Majid Nawaz theory, that this is all. And listen, I understand where Majid is coming from, because he literally did experience a false state of emergency in Egypt that was then used to implement a dictatorship, and he was a victim of that, and he was thrown in jail, right? So he has personal lived experience of authorities using the pretext of an emergency in order to create a dictatorship. However, that doesn't mean that every single time there is an emergency everywhere, authorities are always doing that. Not in liberal democracies like Australia. So either this was all a big ruse to just get us to soften us up, so that next time we will be more amenable to a dictatorial takeover, or it was people in public life, some of whom I know, like the chief of staff of the Prime Minister at the time and the health minister at the time, who found themselves in a once in a century crisis that they were not expecting when they ran for office, and that they have no expertise in, scrambling to figure out what to do with it, taking the best advice of epidemiologists, wanting more than anything not to, in 5 years, feel like they didn't do the things that they could have done in order to head off something like what New York and London and Northern Italy went through in March and April of 2020. And implementing overbearing, clumsy policies that in hindsight seem a little bit ridiculous, but hindsight's 2020. And so, I don't know what decisions I would make in those scenarios either. Nonetheless, the outbound border closure was obviously silly overreach. And so when the border lifted, I was one of the first people out of there. I mean, I wanted to go and visit my in-laws, and I wanted to have my kids meet their grandparents again for the first time in almost 2 years. So we went to the States, and I took a trip to Europe on the side to see some friends there who I hadn't seen since before the pandemic. And so that's right, I was coming from Europe to the States. And to get into the States, you needed to be vaccinated, and Biden was making people, this is December of 2021.
I remember
right?
this.
And you needed to have your PCR test within 48 hours, or a rat test within 24 hours of departure before getting on your flight. And I was on a train from Toulouse in the south of France to Milan in northern Italy, and Omicron was exploding. You remember, like, mid-December of 2021, Omicron was out of control. It was just accelerating so fast. And I'm on this train for like 9 hours with like people coughing all around me. And I'm like, I just got to get my Biden test. I got to get my test. So like I go and I spend a night in a hotel in Milan. And there's this old, wizened, must be the grandparent of the lady who's working at the front desk at the check-in at this cheap hotel, because I'm too cheap to splurge on a good hotel for just a one-night layover. And this wizened old creature is in a wheelchair, pale, going in the reception. And they show me my door, and the door to my room is right next to where this wheelchair is parked, with this old and so I like go inside, and I take a towel and I shove a towel under the door. I'm not worried about my own health. I just want to get into the States because I'm spending Christmas with my family and my in-laws for the first time in the States. This is like the 21st of December. I need to get in. I need my negative test. So I've got towels wedged under the door, and I fling open the windows, and it's snowing in Milan. And I turn on a heater. I wheel the heater over, and I put the heater up to like 150 degrees Fahrenheit next to my bed, and I sleep there. With earplugs in, so I can't hear the coughing coming from outside the door, and snow falling on my face with a radiator heater right in front of me, and the coughing going all night. And I got up in the morning, I'm like, if that fucker has given me COVID, I'm going to be so pissed. And I raced out and got my rat, and I was like, negative, yes, I'm home, baby. But when I got to the States, I was like, why is America testing me? It's already been through. Like, you guys didn't do shit.
I think
you
it's
guys
still testing
completely
people.
mismanaged this thing.
Yeah.
Who gives a fuck? Like, it's already there. What, are you afraid I'm going to bring COVID into your country?
We went
What are you talking
Some
about?
states went Sweden. It's true. Some states did the Swedish model.
But like, it's there. It's everywhere. It's not gonna. It's not making any difference. There's more COVID circulating in the community. Like, it only makes sense to test somebody if they're coming from.
You should be more afraid of coming to America and getting COVID than bringing COVID to America.
Yes. Exactly. It only makes sense to test somebody if the population that they're coming from has a higher density concentration of COVID than your population, so that they're more likely to have it than someone here. It makes no sense if you're coming from a place that may have the same or less COVID.
Josh,
what are we even talking about? Like,
my husband and I went to South Africa for our honeymoon, and it was, if you might recall, end of January of 2021 when the South African variant was popping off. And so every single day as we approached our trip, flights were getting canceled, changed. It was like there were probably 5 people on our long hauls. It was insane. And everyone told us not to go. And I was outraged because I'm like, this is just white Western countries punishing South African, like all these countries. South Africa just identified it first. So they didn't have it first.
Right.
They're just better at science, and we're punishing them. And they already were so. So then they're changing everything in America as we're in South Africa, all the requirements to get back in the country. And we weren't even sure if we'd be able to get back in. And my friends who we went with, we're in Kruger National Park. And they get a false positive and they have to leave like 2 days later. By the way, no one does the math on this when you're traveling like that. It's like, they're like, oh, you have 48 hours. So when we went into South Africa, they were, because of all the time changes and the flights, they're like, this is a little close. I'm like, yeah, no shit. We've been traveling for literally 48 hours because all the flights were canceled. We had a 12-hour layover in France. Like, it was it was so bananas. And my husband was like, are you sure you want to do this? I'm like, look, it's going to be part of the story of traveling during this time because it was so bonkers. They got a false positive in Kruger. I'm like, oh my God, are we just like stuck in Kruger? These are people we had been in a car with for like 4 days, driving around Kruger on safari. And I'm like, oh shit, we might be stuck in Kruger.
And
then the question was, do we get on a plane and go to Cape Town because we have friends in Cape Town? And at least if we have COVID, we'll be in a city. We won't be in like the middle of this national park that also is experiencing flooding at the time. It was amazing and wild. And it ended up being a false positive. They went to like another place and got a test because she's like, I've got to get home to my 4 kids. And they were just making it so hard every day. It was like, we weren't even sure if our flights were going to be canceled out of South Africa, which is so nuts. Like, my friends were like, of course you go. All of our family thought we were going to die of this like horrible South African variant. Like, it was wild.
It's gonna be memories. It's gonna be a lot of memories of that time. It's amazing. I mean, I think at this point, anyone who thinks that people should be required to be vaccinated, unless I would say they are frontline emergency room workers or working in aged care, potentially, has a lot of explaining to do.
And I think this is where that conspiracy-minded thinking came from, because I too have looked around and been like, wow, some people really lost their minds. But maybe
we all did a bit, though, didn't we?
We did, and I have to leave things. I have to remain open to the possibility that perhaps these are just canaries in the coal mine and they can see something that I can't. Like in 10 years, I might be like, wow, James Lindsay was right. Like when I'm...
You may be. I if people haven't heard my interview with James Lindsay as well, that's also interesting to hear on Uncomfortable Conversations, because I do ask him, like, what will need to happen in order for you to, like, give me something that happens in the future that will be the trigger for you to say that you were wrong, and give me something that will be the trigger for me to have to say that you were right.
Oh, that's good. What did he say?
Like, he tried to make it pretty easy for himself by saying that if educational systems around the world start to adopt what the United Nations, UNESCO, like, cultural standards on education are, then that would be evidence that he's right, that the UN is like a global government conspiracy that has stooges planted in governments all over the world to enact its diktats. And I was like, well, no, I'm not going to concede that, because the United Nations is good at being at the vanguard of, like, how you can help people read and write and stuff. UNESCO specifically, the cultural institution. So I'm sure they will go to the same conferences, and I'm sure that like the Alabama Secretary of Education is, like, reading the same texts that the people in Geneva are reading from the UN. So that would just be a kind of a groupthink thing. That wouldn't be, like, it's very hard. That's the beauty of, and I'm sure I'll listen to your interview with Shermer, because I'm sure that's part of what he deals with as well, which is the beauty of the conspiracy is that it's unprovable. I mean,
right.
It's not like conspiracies do well if they have to be held to account. So I think it's highly unlikely that in 10 years you're going to say, oh, James Lindsay was right. Why do I think that? Because right now we're not looking back 10 years ago and saying, oh, 10 years ago, all of the crackpots who were talking about world government taking over the world turned out to be right. So, like, how long do we have to give them?
Yeah, that was something that was really stuck out from my interview with Shermer, because, I was talking about Ignaz Semmelweis, the guy who he was basically said he was a crackpot, but he was the guy who was saying, I'm noticing that if you don't come from an autopsy to delivering a baby, there's a higher, there's a lower mortality rate if you wash your hands. But germ theory hadn't been a thing yet, so he couldn't prove it. So they all laughed at him, and he, because these doctors were, like, doing autopsies and then coming and having labor, and it was disgusting. And
just doing this, just go.
Yeah. So, and they would, like, mock him, and then he ended up in a insane asylum, and they beat him up, and then he died. It's a horribly tragic story. And I was thinking of Sean Lennon had a really funny tweet that said heliocentrism was a conspiracy theory. And first of all, Shermer has a very clear definition of what a conspiracy is, which I think is very helpful. And secondly, he was like, yeah, but think of all the people who were wrong and there were more people who had theories that were wrong that we never heard about than Galileo and Semmelweis, who ended up being right. Like, there's those people far outnumber the people who ended up being correct.
Yeah, it doesn't do much for me, the argument that, like, because you hear it from Christian conservatives and creationists as well. Like, well, your science has been wrong. Just look at all the times that science has been wrong. Not really. Scientific claims that scientists make have been wrong all the time. That's part of science. Science is a self-correcting system.
That's what Shermer was saying.
That is constantly striving towards better evidence, right? So the process of scientific thinking and of rational thinking and of logical thinking and of, like, following where the evidence takes you and of looking at data and not, oh, this happened to my friend, therefore it must be widespread or something. Like, understanding the foibles of human consciousness, all of that is the process of science. And so when when heliocentrism comes along, it gets proven for good reasons by science. And same with the germ theory of disease. That doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that things that aren't scientific now are likelier to be true than things that are scientific. Because if those things are true, then the way that we will prove them to be true is using science.
Right. But I think, again, this is where we talk about and this is what I talked about with Shermer, just the institutional collapse, where I don't know if you guys had George Floyd protests in Australia, because they apparently were all over the world. Just the epidemiologists coming on and signing on and saying, well, racism is the true virus. Like,
Mm.
I don't know how you're
We
going to
didn't have
prove
that bullshit.
I don't know how you're going to prove
We're
that
not that
scientifically,
woke. We
but
don't have
that
that.
broke a lot of brains in the United States. A lot.
That was crazy. I mean, that was crazy. And like the whole, the extraordinary bias towards that side of politics and towards that side of that issue in the mainstream press was something to behold. We're just not that woke in Australia.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think, to go back to kind of like Russell Brand's ascent, he started getting he is very sharp, he's very, very savvy in that respect, I think. And he started seeing a lot of engagement for talking about these global conspiracies. And will we in 10 years be like, well, Russell was right? I don't know what he's predicting for 10 years, but I sometimes wonder. I'm so unsure of myself, and I talk about this a lot with my husband. I don't know if it's the fact that I'm in recovery or an addict, but coming from knowing how good I am at lying to myself, I just don't trust I have a fundamental distrust of my own perception of things, always. And so I never rest easily in being certain about anything because I've been so fucking wrong about so many things. Even recently, I was like, I thought for sure there'd be a red wave in the United States. No red wave.
Yeah. Look, let me leave you with this, Bridget. I think that what you're articulating is actually the healthiest approach towards knowledge and life. And, one of the things that is the great challenges of our lives in the 21st century with social media and the kind of fracturing of our worlds into different prisms of understanding and different silos of knowledge and different voices amid all of this chaos. I mean, the great challenge is to remain humble enough and curious enough to be able to hold on to your own uncertainty and not clamor for certainties, and not hang up your mind in the quest for the comfort of things that instead of things that you just don't know. And I mean, I want to create, part of what I'm doing on my podcast and on my radio show is trying to create a space that is capacious enough to encompass all the voices, and so that we can have a big, rambunctious public square where people can talk about anything they want to in a lighthearted and fun way, where nobody's paying attention to triggering the tripwires that we normally try to care about, and people can just say whatever fuck they want. And I know that that's what you're up to as well. And the more that we can create spaces like that, and the more that we can inhabit spaces where we're open to a whole bunch of different ideas, but not so open-minded that our brains fall out, the more that we can hold more than one idea in our heads at once and not become too siloed. I think that is surely the only way forward in the 21st century. We're not going back to an era of Walter Cronkite talking at us every evening. So we have to be grown up enough to hold on to the uncertainty and go, you know what, I just don't know. I mean, maybe James Lindsay and Russell Brand will be right in 10 years, but right now, I'm going to think they're probably full of shit, because that's the most reasonable thing to think as of this day, right now.
What I know you have to
You're
go,
welcome.
but I'm going to ask you. You're welcome. I know you have to go, and I'm going to ask you my questions really quick. What's your biggest defect of character?
Procrastination.
And what's your biggest asset?
Ambition.
I like those. And where can we? They kind of seem in conflict with one another.
Well, they're both in conflict, and also they can be flip sides of the same thing. Because I think a lot of people who suffer from procrastination suffer from it because they're ambitious, and they want everything they do to be great. And so that becomes a paralyzing fear, because the next project is so much better as long as it only exists in your head. The moment you have to put it out in the world, then you can actually encounter failure, and the failure runs against your desire for ambition.
Right.
So
this is me with
you know what I mean? Like,
no, this is my block
exactly.
with the book.
It's every writer. Every writer has this. I mean, the book in your head is so much better than any book that will ever exist.
The book that I write is just shit.
It's a piece of shit. The one in your head was so great. And so the desire for greatness buried within that is the kernel of I'm just going to get up and clean the kitchen instead of bringing into existence this work of art.
For me, it's organizing the spices. Where can we find you?
Uncomfortable Conversations. Just search for it on your podcast app, Uncomfortable Conversations with Josh Szeps, or subscribe to the Substack, because even at the free level, my Substack, you get a weekly newsletter with links to some of my best radio segments and a little hello from me and some bonus episodes. But also, if you want to pay $5.99 a month, I think it is, then you get a couple of bonus episodes each month and so on. So either Substack, either uncomfortableconversations.substack.com, or just search for Uncomfortable Conversations in your pod.
This has been so fun. I can see why Joe loves talking to you. And this is now our second conversation. I hope we have many more.
I love it.
It went fast. Too fast.
Me too. Great.
But
I know. I could sit here all day.
I know. We'll
gotta
do
go
it
to
again.
work.
We'll do it again.
Excellent. Thanks,
Have a good
Bridget.
day. Good to see you. It's time for the weekly check-in with Bridget and cousin Maggie. Okay. We're moving to Texas.
We are. It's official. Bridget bought a house.
I'm scared to even say that it's official because it's not like closed yet.
Yeah, that's true. Fair enough.
So I'm like, what if something goes horribly awry?
Bridget is in the process of buying a house.
But it seems like it's all going according to plan.
Swimmingly. We'll just, keep going. Act as if.
Yeah. I'm going to keep packing and acting as if this is happening until someone tells me it's not.
Yes.
I feel like I've been just in like an unending process of just getting over my denial that this might actually happen.
Yeah. It seems like the most horrible, arduous process in the entire world. The going through and the paperwork, all the stuff.
It's a lot. It's very demoralizing too. And there's just something it's so vulnerable to like open up the kimono of your finances.
Right. I love that it's a kimono, not like your robe or something.
Your robe, whatever it is.
Just like that was an image.
There's something very
and
revealing.
being reduced to your financial status, basically.
And it's bullshit, so much of it. So much of it is like, they don't take into account that I've paid a certain amount of money for rent for like decades.
Right.
That doesn't even matter. I've never been late on my rent once in 15 years. And it's more or equal to a mortgage.
Right.
And it doesn't matter.
No.
It does not matter.
That's
and if
crazy.
you're self-employed, forget it. It's like, it's so much easier. The whole system is set up to benefit you being like a worker who clocks in and gets a W-2. It doesn't reward entrepreneurship, independence.
Right. At all. Just want you to be a slave to the man.
They want you to be a slave to the man. It feels that way. And then there's all this weird stuff too that I would have to really dig into like the underwriting of the underwriting. And if I was someone with more time, I would. And if I was maybe a lawyer, I would, because I feel like I actually probably could. I feel like there's a lawsuit that somebody could file, maybe even me. But the way that it was being explained to me, because of the Biden administration, there's all this talk about reparations. So there's ways that they're going about this without having to even go about it or pass it through as bill. One of these ways seems to be that if you are a minority with a low credit score, you will be given a better interest rate than, for instance, me, a white lady with a good credit score, which is like their way of trying to
atone for slavery.
Or to help people who have traditionally been
kept out of the housing. Yeah.
Which is true and fair. And I mean, I don't know if it's fair, but it's true that there's been redlining. There's been all kinds of mechanisms that have kept minorities from home ownership, including women, by the way, not just minority women, women in general. But it's frustrating for someone like me who went fucking bankrupt and had no credit and worked for years
to build it.
Lived in a cash world for 10 years and then worked for another 15 years or whatever it's taken, or however long. I guess it's been 5 years that I've spent repairing my credit.
Right.
And working very hard to get it back up. And that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like, never mind that I'm a a woman who went bankrupt and has done all the right things I'm not getting any kind of interest rate deduction for that.
It just all sounds like a nightmare. I'm not looking forward to it for whenever in the future I can buy my house.
Just make sure you've got.
I know. I'm looking at what I've got and I'm like, well, I'm nowhere close.
It's tough right now because of the interest rates too, although it sounds like they're going to go up. I've learned a lot. Buying a house is like having a baby. That is the closest thing that I can. It is such a steep learning curve in such a short period of time with all kinds of jargon that you're either expected to know or you have to learn. I can see how it would be so easy to stumble into a bad deal or get swindled. Or I luckily have an uncle who's a brilliant lawyer who used to be a broker.
Right.
Like, I don't know how anybody does this just on their own, trying to Google stuff and has somebody making sure that there's so much room for being taken advantage of.
Right.
You can be taken advantage of all across. There's so many people just taking money from you. All the inspections and all this stuff that you need. Oh, you need this and that and title insurance and what are points, and it's all it's demoralizing the process, but then it also made me feel like a fucking moron, which I regularly feel like. And I'm lucky enough to have somebody who could explain things to me and help me and walk me through it. I don't know what I would have done otherwise.
Right. But at the end of it, you're going to have a house and we're going to have a new Phetasy headquarters.
And we're going to be in Texas.
Never in a million years would I have thought I would
Life is so weird.
Wind up living in Texas.
Life. If you had told me I was going to be a suburban wife in Texas when I got 40s, sober, I would have been like, get out of here. You're obviously on drugs still. Yeah. It just, none of it makes sense. Life is weird. Life is so weird, but I'm excited.
It's huge.
I always try to it's again like having a baby, because you're trying to kind of manage your own expectations and excitement. And it's also scary because it feels like a huge responsibility. And now this is like, I've been a renter my entire life. It's now all on me to take care of this thing and to make sure that it stays in a good condition. And if something goes wrong, I'm not calling someone to be like, hey,
come fix this. You're like, oh, I have to find someone to fix this.
And you have to make sure they're trustworthy.
Right.
It's just, it's definitely like there was one of the writing prompts in Write Club that was like, when was the first time you've felt like a grown up? And I was like, today, like this week. I have a child in a house, and now I feel like a grown up.
Officially.
I didn't have to worry about any of this stuff. And life insurance suddenly, and
homeowners
insurance, and being a grown up is just having a shitload of insurance.
And paperwork.
That's all it is. You are fully a grown up when you just have like 4 or 5 different insurance policies.
That's true. Not to mention multiple life insurance policies.
I don't know. I'm just also exhausted. I went to Park City and like a whirlwind 24-hour trip.
I know. 24 hours. There
I was back.
Yeah.
I was like, that was crazy, but it was fun. It was fun to go back to where we live.
I know. I really would love to go back there. It's so gorgeous.
There. I love it there. Even driving in, I'm like, God, I love it here. It's so beautiful. It's just, I like Utah. I easily could have, had we not had to keep on working, had I like struck it rich there's a reason that I still have to do all this, because I definitely could see just checking out. Like if I had Tim Dillon money, I would be like, get me a mansion in freaking Utah. I don't want anything to do with any of this. And then I would just fly. I would just fly around and do comedy.
And do writing.
And do my podcast from my freaking fireside, podcast studio.
Right. We'll get there.
It'd be amazing. But it's been a whirlwind.
It certainly has.
And now it's like,
this is like a big level up. I feel like, just even the ability to have space. We're going to have a media room where we can just shoot all our stuff.
Maggie will be living with us for a while we all get our bearings.
While we all get settled. And Bridget and I will just be working 24/7.
Yeah, I know.
like
Jaren's
the
going to
old
love
days.
that. He's like, last week when I was writing on the roast with Whitney, I was up until like 2 o'clock, but I had work all day. And then this was like an extra gig.
Right.
And he's like, are you okay? Or this feels a little addicty to me. Are you working till 2? I'm like, I always used to work like this. I just haven't been, but I need to be working like this again because I've got that's what it's going to take.
It's the surge of growth energy, you know?
Now is the time
to dig deep and put in the time.
These are my earning years.
Yeah.
Need to dig deep for like another 15 years. I was just talking to somebody and I haven't really dipped my toe into the culture wars. I've just been ignoring them and too busy to even pay attention. And I was definitely like, oh God, I was talking about just some of the rifts I see happening in the Conservative Party that will probably be exacerbated by whatever happens in 2024, leading into the election. And the weird, like, moderate versus extremist fight that seems to be escalating hilariously.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, there's some interesting trends I'm seeing that I think are really going to bloom in the next couple of years.
We'll be on the ground in Texas watching it happen.
Hell yeah! Pew, 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 pew! Tune in next week for another riveting episode that will change your life, help you get out of your own way, and solve all the world's problems. I want to thank our composer, Jared Elias, my co-producer and cousin, Maggie, and all of you out there listening. This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.